Hey y'all, welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bonnethead and I do horror analysis on the internet. First things first, I want to wish everybody a happy Valentine's Day, whether you had somebody to share it with or not. But aside from that, let's get into my pick for today's horror analysis. This may seem like kind of a different pick for me because it's not really widely considered to be a horror movie. It's more considered to be a comedy sci-fi movie, but when I watched it, this is my third time watching it now, I can't help but pick up on so many different horror notes. And I can't help but think that the plot premise itself is very horrific, and I think you'll understand what I mean when I say that. And we also can't just ignore the fact that the sci-fi genre has very strong roots in horror. And when I was thinking about which film I wanted to analyze next, this one felt extremely relevant to me. This film felt particularly relevant to me because of our current political, economic, and social landscape and how a lot of conspiracy theories have kind of been confirmed for us. So without pushing it off any further, today we're going to be discussing Sorry to Bother You. You know I have to do it every time, but a moment of appreciation for this iconic imagery. I mean, seriously, this is sick. But that's besides the point. This movie was written and directed by Boots Riley, and it came out in 2018. This was Boots Riley's first big movie. It really sort of launched his career into the limelight. It led to his Amazon Prime limited series, I Am a Virgo, coming out, and he has a movie coming out this summer called I Love Boosters. He has a very consistent style. It's very absurdist, very cartoonish, and very colorful. Like I said, lots of cartoonish elements, lots of highly saturated colors, very 90s coded. These stylistic choices paint the film as a very, very satirical piece. But as you're watching it, you kind of realize that it so closely parallels real life that it almost doesn't even feel like satire. The most satirical thing about it really does feel like the stylistic choices. The film was very well received, especially by the critics, who gave them a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. It only ended up getting a 70% from the audience, but that's still pretty high. And before we get into it, let's go through the cast. We have Lakeith Stanfield, who is a very familiar face in black film, playing the main character Cassius Green. The name itself is already a satirical element to the film. It's supposed to sound like Cash is green. But aside from that, Cassius is this main character who is supposed to represent the average American. He's trying to find a job where he can make money and be happy and not just feel like he's surviving. Next, we have Tessa Thompson, who is playing Detroit. Detroit is Cassius's girlfriend, but she also plays an artist activist. She very much represents what she believes in, and she wants to express that through her work. We also get a really funny note about her name and how her parents wanted her to have an American name, so they named her Detroit. That's just a little tidbit that I thought was a lot of fun. Next, we have Stephen Ewan, who is playing Squeeze. Squeeze is Cassius's co-worker at Regal View, and he's the leader of the Regal View union strike. But we later find out that Squeeze kind of goes from place to place and workplace to workplace, forming unions and starting strikes to kind of fight for workers' rights. Next, we have Jermaine Fowler, who is playing Sal. Throughout the film, I couldn't help but think of him as a Chris Tucker-like character in Friday. Him and Cassius's dynamic is very much like that. Lastly, I'm going to mention Armie Hammer, who plays Steve Lift. Steve Lift is the CEO of a major corporation in this film called Worry Free. So with all of the cast and characters out of the way, let's get into the plot of the film. So like I said, Cassius Green is pretty much your everyday American from Oakland, California. He's in search of a job that will pay him enough to survive. Currently, he's living in his uncle's garage, and that is just not cutting it. I mean, he can hardly even afford to do that. But he ends up getting a job as a telemarketer at a company called Regal View. Now, this company will pretty much take anybody who can read a script. But he's told that if he works hard enough and he makes enough sales, that he can end up becoming what is called a power caller, which is a mysterious higher up position at the company where the real money is made. But as Cassius becomes more involved in the company and sort of works his way up this company ladder, he starts unraveling a conspiracy theory that he never expected to find out about. So with that little refresher out of the way, let's get into my message analysis. And we encounter three major themes throughout this entire film. We repeatedly see themes of late-stage capitalism, abuse of the working class, and media complicity. Now, the term late-stage capitalism gets thrown around a lot, sometimes incorrectly. So I want to explain it a little bit here so that I know we're all on the same page. It can be a very complicated term with a lot of different moving pieces, so I just want to make sure we all understand what it means so we can understand the film to the best of our ability. At its heart, capitalism, in its ideal state anyways, thrives largely under two things, that being the premise or expectation of indefinite growth and innovation through competition. But unfortunately, indefinite growth is not a realistic expectation under any circumstances. So the term late-stage capitalism refers to the stage of capitalism that we are currently in right now. A stage where we have largely hit the limit of our growth, which has basically ceased or put a cap on that expectation of indefinite. But what does that really mean for us, right? It can be difficult and complicated to picture what reaching your limit of growth really looks like for an entire economy, especially one as large as ours, but it comes with a few key symptoms. A major symptom that is a really big part of this film is significant wealth disparities. We also often see high debt levels, the commodification of really all aspects of life. This can mean healthcare, this can mean housing, this can mean basic goods and necessities, and a more recent one being the commodification of personal data. We also often see the stagnation or even worsening of purchasing power. So what is that dollar really worth? How far can it get you? But at the same time, the cost of goods and services continues to rise. But there's one symptom of late-stage capitalism that we're largely going to be covering today in this film. Our system eventually reaches a point wherein we are no longer prioritizing human well-being and innovation as a form of promoting competition. Instead, we begin optimizing for the accumulation of assets and capital as a form of wealth. Now, like I said, this often leads to a lack of innovation that meaningfully contributes to quality of life or human well-being. So instead of the invention of the car, which revolutionized transportation, we're getting the invention of AI, which largely just increases company share profits. The good of society and human well-being is no longer considered when creating new products. Instead, we're considering how can I get my share prices to increase. Like I said, it's more about how do I obtain more capital and not about how do I create a truly good product, which in an ideal scenario is what capitalism tries to promote. Now, we're shown these ideas of late-stage capitalism largely through Cassius's relationship with the company Regalview throughout the film. Like I went over previously, Cassius is desperate for a job so that he can just barely afford to survive in his uncle's garage. In doing this, though, he really struggles to feel that there's any real purpose to what he's doing. He expresses to Detroit that he feels that he is only working to survive. He doesn't actually feel passionate about what he's doing, and he doesn't feel like he's meaningfully contributing to society. Whereas she, on the other hand, does get to meaningfully contribute to society and do something that she loves, which is again being an artist. But in any case, what we're really discussing here is this idea of occupation versus vocation, where Cassius feels that what his job is, what he's doing for work, is just something to occupy himself, whereas Detroit is doing something that she can vocate her life to. Cassius wants to have a vocation and feel good about what he's doing, but ultimately he doesn't really feel like he has a choice. He has to make money to survive. So we end up really getting a look into the mindset of the lower class through Cassius's view on things. But his outlook on things starts to kind of change once he starts working as a telemarketer at Regalview, because he's sold this idea that pretty much anybody, if they work hard enough, like I said, can become a power caller. So we're really seeing this pick yourself up by the bootstraps, achieve the American dream kind of notion being sold to him here, despite the fact that many workers who have been there for years have not made it to that power call status. We see that from Sal. Sal tells Cassius that they were stringing him along for months telling him that he was going to be a power caller, and they were telling him that really just to pacify him. But the reason why becoming a power caller is so sought after is because of the insane pay difference that they get. There's a significant pay disparity between the foundation of the company, all of the telemarketers, and the power callers. One of Cassius's co-workers, who's played by Danny Glover, explains this pay disparity to us. He says, they not selling the shit we selling. And he also says it's like comparing apples to the Holocaust, which is a really interesting comparison to make. But in making that comparison, we're really painting the picture that we don't really know what they're doing up there. And their jobs are so different from what the telemarketers are doing that the pay disparity has to exist. It's a completely different world, so it's a completely different pay. And also because you're so high up and you're so powerful, that is why nobody on the lower level is really allowed to know what they're doing. It's a very mysterious position. Nobody on the lower levels knows what goes on with the power callers literally at all. They're not even allowed on their floor, never mind knowing what they do as a job. So here we're really seeing those hints at the true separations of the classes. Again, with those significant pay disparities of late stage capitalism. We also see Regalview using a lot of conventional corporate jargon that's really just meant to pacify the lower ranking employees. We have the abbreviated STTS, which just means stick to the script, not giving the employees really any credit to be smart enough to make their own sales pitch. And we also do the thing that a lot of companies are known for doing, which is we're a family here and we're team members. Again, this is a way of pacifying employees to distract them from the fact that they're paid too little and they work too much. We also see who I believe is the founder of Regalview up on the wall. He's really idealized and he's featured on the wall in one of the many pictures that they have of him up, shaking hands with really who is the face of American capitalism today. He's also a large reason why we're in the place politically and economically that we are today. That's right. He's shaking hands with Ronald Reagan. So we see the upper class continuously idealizing this broken system that is really only benefiting them. Another thing that we see that is very interesting is that Cassius is really struggling to make any sales at all until he starts listening to the advice of his coworker. He starts using his white voice, which Danny Glover explains to us doesn't mean to talk proper or without a black accent. It means to talk like you don't have any care in the world, like you don't have to worry about finances. Talk like you have privilege. Now, Cassius is blackness is discussed and challenged a few times in the film, and we kind of see the struggle happening live when he's struggling between remaining loyal to the movement and wanting to make more money. We also see a photo of Cassius's father, I believe. It's never really confirmed, but we see the photo constantly changing between being proud and disappointed of Cassius. This is mostly in relation to his decision to either stray from or stand by his morals. So we're seeing a very classic struggle that a lot of Americans specifically face between playing into the system so that you feel you can survive and rebelling against it to hopefully see some change. Now, I just mentioned Regal View's workers union, so let's talk about that a little bit more. Early on in the film, Cassius is approached by his co-worker Squeeze. Squeeze wants Cassius to join the workers union strike so that the telemarketers can get fair pay. This is in light of the pay gap between the telemarketers and the corporate higher-ups, aka the power callers. So again, we're pointing out that wealth gap. Now, Cassius very hesitantly joins this movement after persuasion from his peers, but ultimately he ends up turning his back on the whole thing. He was only hesitant at first because he felt like he was making a lot of progress in the company and he was doing really well. He wanted to ultimately be promoted to a power caller. And again, this is all because he's using his white voice. He's pretending to be somebody that he's not, which is a form of masking so that you can climb the corporate ladder. Now, ultimately, he was right. He does end up getting offered a position as a power caller, and he takes the position even in the midst of a strike. Now, he makes this decision out of a desire for increase in pay. He feels like he'd be stupid to turn it down. But as a result, his friends, who have now all become his co-workers, see him as a traitor or a sellout. He is now one less person that is contributing to the movement, and in their eyes, he's ultimately become one of them, one of those who has been corrupted by the money, one of those who is contributing to the problem. Now, when Cassius becomes a power caller, we end up seeing what that world looks like, and it is extremely out of touch. They have reached such a high status that they feel completely separated from the real world. Cassius is now only allowed to use his white voice when he's at work. Again, he's having to change who he is in order to get this job and perform. So again, we're seeing that you have to be a certain kind of person to sort of fit into this club. He uses it so much that he later slips into this voice unconsciously outside of work. So we kind of see that he's slowly but surely losing himself in this position. His girlfriend and his friends separate themselves from him. Again, he's abandoning his moral standings. And like I said, he's slipping into this voice that he's been using for work in regular everyday life. The separation between the working class and the power callers is so great that we're not even allowed to hear the other power callers' names. I'd also like to note here that we never really figure out what Regal View actually sells. We don't really know what their product is, so we're just kind of left to assume that they're sort of a middleman. They're basically a sales team for hire by other companies. But it is only once you become a power caller that you can really learn how Regal View actually makes its money. We learn that yes, Regal View is in fact a middleman. They are in fact salesmen for hire. But what they're selling is US manufactured weaponry to other countries. They also sell slave labor. Now, their biggest client is Worry Free. This is where they get all of the slave labor that they sell to other companies. And they sell it by saying that the slave labor will increase product efficiency and profit margins, which is where we get into my second major theme, which is the abuse of the working class. Now, this theme is largely presented through the corporate conglomerate that we've been talking about, Worry Free. I believe this conglomerate is very clearly supposed to be a parody of Amazon, the everything company, with the slave labor allegations and all of the taking over of every single market. It seems like a pretty direct comparison to me. But to drive my point home further, Worry Free is a manufacturing company that claims to basically make anything and everything, and they make it at a significantly lower price than any other manufacturer will. This is due to their maximized efficiency. They're able to maintain this efficiency by offering their workers a job, housing, and food in exchange for their work. And once you have this position, you supposedly have it for life. So again, we're very closely mimicking this concept of slave labor under the guise of not having to worry about your finances. So it's in the name, Worry Free. It's made very clear to us that people begin working at Worry Free out of desperation. It's not an ideal job, and you're basically just a factory worker that works on a manufacturing line. You have zero individuality and zero room for upward momentum, so you're basically treated like cattle. Everyone's wearing the same uniforms, everyone's packed into these rooms that pretty heavily mimic prison cells, and you're forced to bunk with your co-workers. You don't even get an apartment to yourself. The depictions of work at Worry Free very closely mimic sweatshops. But the CEO of the company, Steve Lift, actually defends the working conditions by saying that they're saving lives. He says that they're providing jobs for society. And this completely ignores not only the horrendous working conditions, but also the fact that the mere existence of this company is what causes people to be in these desperate situations in the first place. They're creating a problem so that they can fix it, which, again, another major symbol of late-stage capitalism. I mean, this company completely depends on broke and desperate people for their labor. We see this comparison being made with Detroit's electric chair earrings. They're overlaid on top of a billboard ad for Worry Free. The ad depicts a man sitting on a couch with text that reads, "Show the world you're a responsible daddy." This targets low-income men that don't necessarily feel that they have the means to provide for their family, and it suggests that the responsible way to do that is by working for Worry Free. We also see that Worry Free has the backing of the government. It's shown very briefly, but there's a newspaper article that states that the Senate committee actually cleared the company of any wrongdoing, any slavery charges at all, even though the evidence seems pretty damning. But we're actually exposed to Worry Free's true intentions not long after Cassius becomes a power caller. Cassius is doing so well as a power caller and becomes so successful that he actually ends up being invited to one of Steve Lift's parties. At this party, Cassius is humiliated, he's racially profiled, and practically forced to put on a minstrel show for Steve Lift and his friends. This is all meant to get in Steve Lift's good graces. He's their biggest client. He can't make him upset. But when Cassius meets with Steve one-on-one, we find out how dark the company Worry Free really is. We find out that Worry Free wants to turn its employees into literal workhorses. This is so that they don't have the typical limitations of the human body and they can work harder. But the workhorses are terrifying looking and very much in pain. Steve reveals that he wants to turn Cassius into a workhorse, but not for the same reason. He wants to use Cassius as a Trojan horse for the company. Having enough sense to know that the employees then turned horses would end up taking issue with the whole thing, Worry Free wants to get ahead of this issue by taking Cassius and using him as a plant. Cassius would be going undercover as a horse person so that he can be an activist that's actually being controlled by the company. In this way, the employees remain under the company's control regardless of how antsy they get. I think it's worth noting here that Steve's only selling points are that he would be paid a lot of money and that he would have a horse. This just shows how much power is really the only thing that these people care about, which is the same reason why we hear these sexual affirmations in the power caller's elevator. The desire is power, even if that gets down to a sexual level. Cassius refuses this offer, and after learning about everything, he actually wants to blow this case wide open. He wants to expose the company by going to the media with the information that he has, and on top of that, he rejoins his peers as an activist. But this is only after he realizes that he was only rising to the top to be screwed over and used by those who were already there. Again, use and abuse of the working class. Even those who make it don't actually make it. They'll make you think that you can be one of them, but you never will be. But despite all of this, Cassius ends up organizing a very successful protest against the company Worry Free and Regal View. This ends up beginning his life as a true radical activist for the horse people, but a true one, not like how Worry Free wanted him to be one. Unfortunately, at the end of the movie, we see that he ends up being turned into a horse anyways, but this just reinforces the idea of always being screwed over by those at the top. It also reinforces the idea of him being a political activist and leader for these horse people. Now, I mentioned Cassius going to the media with the information that he has, which leads me into my third theme. The film pretty heavily touches on themes of media complicity, and it's not in a super obvious way. But we see throughout the film that the media is actually very complicit in the normalization of Worry Free's intentions. All of the shows that we see on the TV are complete slop. There's a show called I Got the Kicked Out of Me, which is a humiliation ritual that's just broadcast on live television. But it's also later the only way that Cassius ends up being able to play his footage that he has on live television. He has actual documented proof and footage of Worry Free turning people into horses, but the only way he could get people to listen is if he humiliated himself on TV. Otherwise, all of the journalists that he contacted just thought that he was a conspiracy theorist. We also got another brief showing of a newspaper article title, which indicated that horse people were a completely separate group of individuals that were stealing jobs from regular people, which indicated that they were an enemy and not victims. We also saw a parody of MTV Cribs called NTV Spots, which featured a worry-free worker showing off their worry-free bunk. They don't really have a room or a crib or a spot at that. But this ends up normalizing the circumstances of being a worry-free worker and ultimately promoting it as a job. We also see that nobody in the media takes Cassius seriously. He turns into a meme, and becoming the butt of a joke makes him look a lot less credible. We also see that news reports are not necessarily focused on how egregious the crimes of Worry Free are, but they end up showing how Worry Free stock prices are rising as a result of other companies thinking it was a great idea to turn people into horses. All of this makes the media extremely complicit in the crimes that Worry Free is committing. So finally, closing thoughts. I truly believe that the thesis of this film is really examining just how much power the elite want to have over the public. And in that, we sort of get to discuss how little they think of us. They want us to work for them, and they will do anything to make sure that it stays that way. They want us to have as little freedom as humanly possible while getting us to think that we have the most freedom, and by getting us to believe that they actually remain in complete control over us. And that main tool of manipulation is the media. We've talked about the corrupt corruption of the media in a couple of films that I've analyzed now, but I think it's a really smart critique to make, so I'm not mad at it. All in all, I thought this film was super, super fun, and I'm really excited to see what Boots Riley's movie is going to look like this summer. He seems to have some really interesting things to say, and I really appreciate his style. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have. Let me know of any movies that you guys want me to cover next. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this analysis, and if you have, maybe consider leaving a like or even subscribing if you want to see more horror analysis like this. Anyways, see y'all. Bye!